My name is Matt Wilson. I am a lawyer by day and electronic musician, composer at all other times. I would consider myself a composer and a producer, and I hesitate to say artist, but someone who is trying to create interesting, unique, and ultimately joyous and beautiful sounds. I'm trying to create a mood or an atmosphere or a feeling or an emotion. And I suppose that's what any artist attempts to do, creating something out of nothing. The last time I've done live performance was at what we call a house party. And it was done with more of a concept of what I wanted to do rather than the actual sounds that were going to be produced. That performance consisted of an analog sequencer, which is a series of voltages that control the pitch of homemade analog synthesizers. So the performance itself consisted of a machine that memorizes about 64 voltages and homemade, home-built analog sequencer or analog synthesizer modules and effects units, delays, and things like that. And it was composed or performed on the fly. It was improvised. It was mostly low, droning sounds. I think in some sense I was hoping to blow out a speaker or something like that. And as I seem to recall, there was something had happened to that extent that night. There's a group of friends who produce music or who try to produce music. And it's a social thing without a doubt. I'm not particularly deeply involved in any commercial music production, both by choice at this time and by other, lifestyle type constraints. But in San Francisco, there's an electronic music underground, I suppose, that I think has at least two facets. One is a very above ground sort of techno and house club music production, which San Francisco is very well known for. There's a San Francisco house sound that is marketed and is commercial. I'm not involved in that whatsoever. I think at one time I aspired to, but the taste of it that I saw was really no different than rock and roll bands, performances, records, and that sort of thing. And that did appeal to me at one time. Does not appeal to me now. So socially, relationship-wise, yeah, there's a group of people that are producing music, one of whom is Josh Marymount, producing under the name of Thermal and putting out records of his own, which are very nice, and I highly recommend that people search them out on the Box label. This is what I consider to be a very well-appointed electronic music production facility, for lack of better words. It is a lot of analog synthesizers, which had been more or less obsolete by the mid-'80s, by the introduction of the Yamaha DX7, which is a digital synthesizer. They went out of fashion because of tuning problems, size, perceived limitation, things like that. The whole electronic music studio concept began in the 50s with, but I think it really developed sort of contemporaneously amongst the different nations. There was electronic music being produced in the 50s in New York, I believe. And back then, what was considered electronic music, and this I think is really the same for both post-war Europe and America, they were producing music based upon the tools that were being afforded by magnetic tape. These particular creators at that time, Pierre Schaeffer, Pierre Henry in France, the German music studio producers, Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, the American American producers, Vladimir Yusashevsky, Otto Luning. They were all producing music using tapes, manipulation of tape, manipulation of purely electronic sounds. And the way that you get to analog synthesizers from there is, sort of it's a fairly direct route. The first real analog synthesizer was the RCA Mark II, which was installed into the Columbia-Princeton Electronic Music Laboratory in, I believe, 1958. And it takes up an entire wall, and it is an oscillator, it is a tube-driven sound-producing device that memorizes voltages and whatnot, and controls the pitch of the oscillators using voltages. Dr. Robert Moog in the early 60s began manufacturing and inventing a device that would be a keyboard-based version of all of these. Prior to that, there hadn't been a keyboard, as in the pearly whites. There hadn't been a way to control these early synthesizers. And Robert Moog came up with a method or a device or an invention that controlled the pitch of the oscillator by voltage in 12-tone equal temperament, so that the lowest note on the keyboard, for instance a C, would send out 0 volts to the oscillator. The next octave up, the next C, it would be sending out 1 volt, and everything in between would be 1/12 of a volt. I mean, experimental music. That term in and of itself, I think, has become as, as bland as techno music or disco music. It's a label. But there is a wide variety of experimental music based on the electronic medium that is in production today. And the artists that are doing that are far too many to list. Some of the ones that I enjoy are Oval, who are from Germany. I'd consider Mouse on Mars, who's a German group as well, who produce music that's a little bit more club-oriented or techno-oriented, but is extremely creative in finding new sounds, which is probably what experimental music really would mean, is that new sounds are being used to create music. Their latest record has acoustic guitars that are sampled on it, all kinds of sort of unidentified musical, UMOs, unidentified musical objects. And that might be what experimental music really is. I haven't made any effort to submit recordings to record labels. I have not pursued that avenue. I'll do it at some point. But at this juncture, what I'm doing is I'm working on really the craft element of it. I want to be able to control the machines and make them do just what I want to do. And when there is a product that I feel is good enough, is interesting enough for submission to the public, then it will get submitted. And if you're wondering how it would be accepted or ignored, I don't know. I mean, what's the use of putting out a record if nobody likes it? What's the use of putting out a record if no one knows it exists? Right now, the music that's being made is being made for myself, for my studio. I've actually been going back and listening to material. I have years and years of material on tape with varying degrees of affinity for it. I have distributed music to friends. I have let other people hear some of the work that I'm doing. But I'd like to get it out there to people without a doubt. But of course, you got to please yourself with it. And then, like anything else, you cook a good meal and you sit down and you eat it by yourself, and that's rewarding, and you're fulfilled, and your stomach is full, and you're satiated, But there's also a great pleasure in providing a meal to somebody else, and they go, "Hey, that was a good meal," and it'd be the same thing as passing on music. And who knows? Maybe the analogy is a chef, someone who cooks a meal for the unknown person, and that unknown person comes up and says, my credit to the chef, and that you have produced something, and that's really what it is, a record or a CD or a tape or what have you. It's just a thing, That's all it is. Just like a piece of food or a good meal is a thing, but it can have far-reaching impact upon the eater or the listener, or really eater and listener. You know, that's consumer, right? Consumer of food on one level and consumer of musical product on the